A simple life for a simple mind. That's what he called me. Mr. Sterling, the real estate developer with a suit that cost more than my boat's engine, stood on the Gloucester dock pointing at me like I was a zoo exhibit. His smile was slick with condescension as his investors looked on, their faces a mixture of pity and amusement. He was the future, and I, with my rust-stained hands and the permanent smell of brine, was just a piece of local color he was about to bulldoze. The shame burned hotter than any sun, but the ocean has a way of settling scores. 2 days later, miles from that smug face, my winch screamed. It wasn't the groan of a heavy catch, it was the shriek of metal at its breaking point. From the gray depths, I pulled up an impossibly old rope, leading to something dark and massive. Would you have the courage to see what was on the other end? Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. My name is Cal Hatcher. I'm 40 years old, but some days my bones feel 100 years older. They carry the weight of 3 generations of Hatcher men who've worked these same waters off the coast of Gloucester. My world is the deck of the Sea Dog, a 38-foot trawler my grandfather built with his own hands. The wood is soaked with so much salt and history that it's more a part of the ocean than the land. Most people see a rust-streaked, beaten-down vessel that's long past its prime. But when I stand at the helm, I feel my father's hand on my shoulder. I hear my grandfather's laughter in the groan of the hull. It's more than a boat. It's the only thing I have left that feels like mine. But in a town that's trading its soul for luxury condos and tourist traps, being a fisherman like me is like being a living ghost. You're a nice story, a piece of local color, as they call it. And no one reminded me of that more than Mr. Sterling. The humiliation he dished out on the dock that day wasn't the first time. It was just the loudest. I see him around town, holding court in the diner where my dad used to drink coffee with his crew. I'll be sitting at the counter, my hands clean but permanently stained with grease and rust, and he'll walk in with his associates. He never says my name. He just nods in my direction and says something like, "See? That's what I'm talking about. The heart of the old town. We have to preserve that, in a museum perhaps." And his friends would chuckle, a polite, cruel sound that bounced off the linoleum floor. The waitress, a girl whose father lost his boat a decade ago, would just look at her shoes, her face tight with a shame that wasn't hers. I'd just sip my cold coffee and stare out the window at the harbor, pretending I didn't hear, pretending the words didn't feel like stones sinking in my gut. Another time, I was at the marine supply shop, trying to find a used gasket for my aging engine. The owner, a good man named Sal, was helping me look through old boxes in the back. Sterling came in, his shoes clicking on the concrete floor. He was looking for a new satellite navigation system for his yacht, something that cost more than I made in 6 months. He saw me holding the greasy, cracked piece of rubber in my hand. He didn't even try to hide his smirk. "Still trying to keep that relic afloat, Cal?" he asked, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You have to know when to let go of the past. Progress is coming. You can't fight the tide with a bucket." Sal shot him a dark look, but I just shrugged. "She still runs," I said, my voice quiet. Sterling just shook his head, a look of profound pity on his face, as if I were a child who refused to believe in airplanes. He turned to Sal and said, loud enough for the whole store to hear, "Put his little part on my tab, Sal. A donation to the Historical Society." I felt my face burn hot. I dropped the gasket on the counter, muttered, "I'm good," and walked out, the sound of his condescending laughter following me into the street. That's my life. A series of small, quiet cuts that bleed you dry of your pride. The day it all changed started like any other. The alarm went off at 3:30 in the morning. The sky outside my window still a deep, inky black, studded with cold, distant stars. The air had a sharp, wet chill to it that promised a thick fog. I made my coffee, pulled on my boots, and walked down to the dock, my footsteps echoing in the pre-dawn silence. The Sea Dog was waiting, bobbing gently in the water, a faithful old friend. The familiar smell of diesel and brine filled my lungs as I started the engine. It coughed and sputtered to life with a deep rumbling groan that I knew as well as my own heartbeat. I was heading out 12 miles, past Thatcher Island, chasing a cod run that I'd heard about on the radio. It was a gamble, but fuel was expensive, and my catch lately had been barely enough to cover it. As the sun began to bleed a pale, watery light across the horizon, the fog rolled in, just as I'd expected. It was a real Gloucester fog, thick as wool, swallowing the sky and the sea until there was no difference between them. The world shrank to a 50-foot circle of gray water around my boat. The only sounds were the thrum of my engine and the mournful bellow of a distant foghorn. There's a strange peace in that kind of isolation. It's just you and the ocean. No condescending developers, no pitying looks, no overdue bills. For a few hours, you can almost forget the world you left behind on the shore. I had my lines out, trolling slow, watching the sonar for any sign of life below. The work was mechanical, something my hands knew how to do without my mind even being involved. I was thinking about Sterling, about his words. A simple life for a simple mind. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just too stubborn, too simple to see that this way of life was already dead and buried at sea. That's when it happened. It started with a jolt that shuddered through the entire boat, a violent lurch that nearly threw me off my feet. Then came the sound. It wasn't the familiar groan of the winch straining against a heavy net full of fish. This was a scream. A high-pitched metallic shriek of pure agony, like the sound of a giant tearing steel with his bare hands. The engine whined, the RPMs dropping as the propeller fought against an immovable force. My heart leaped into my throat. I'd snagged something. A wreck, probably. It happened, but this felt different. The tension on the line was immense, terrifying. The winch motor was smoking, the smell of burning electronics filling the air. I cut the power immediately, the sudden silence deafening. The Sea Dog was listing hard to the starboard side, the deck tilting at a dangerous angle. Whatever I was caught on was trying to pull me under. I was 12 miles from shore, alone in a world of gray, and tethered to something monstrous in the deep. My first instinct was to cut the line, to save my boat, to save myself. But that gear, that was everything. Losing it would be the end. So I took a deep breath, the cold, damp air stinging my lungs, and re-engaged the winch, determined to see what had a hold of me. Would you have cut the line, or would you have risked it all to see what was on the other end? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to find out what came out of that water. My hand hovered over the big knife I keep wedged next to the helm, the one sharp enough to slice through a 2-inch hawser with a single desperate pull. It was the only sane choice. The Sea Dog was groaning, the starboard rail dipping dangerously close to the water. The sea was trying to claim her, and whatever was on the other end of that line was its anchor. Cut the line, sail away, live to fish another day. Every instinct, every lesson my father and grandfather ever beat into my head screamed at me to do it. But as I reached for the handle, Sterling's face swam into view in my mind's eye, his smile dripping with condescension. You have to know when to let go of the past. He'd said it with such pity, as if I were a child clinging to a broken toy. Cutting this line, it felt like proving him right. It felt like admitting that I was just a relic, unable to handle the pressures of the modern world, beaten by a snag in the deep. A stubborn, foolish pride, hot and sharp, flared in my chest. No, I wasn't going to run. I was a hatcher. We don't cut the line, we haul it. The main winch was useless, its motor giving off a foul, burnt plastic smell. I'd have to do this the old way, the hard way. I grabbed my heaviest set of gloves, the leather worn smooth in the palms, and scrambled to the bow. The capstan winch, a brute of a thing that ran off a separate hydraulic, was my only hope. It was slow, loud, and unforgiving, but it was strong. I unspooled the snagged trawl line from the main drum. A dangerous, exhausting task in itself. The tension on it so great the wire hummed like a giant guitar string. One slip and it would have taken my arm off. I managed to get a secondary line around it, a thick nylon rope, and ran it to the capstan. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The whole setup was a jury-rigged mess, something that would make a safety inspector faint. But out here, you do what you have to do. I threw the lever. The capstan roared to life, and the nylon rope went taut with a crack like a rifle shot. The Sea Dog listed even further, the deck tilting so steeply I had to brace my feet against the rail. For a moment, nothing happened. It was a stalemate, a 38-foot trawler against the dead weight of the ocean's secret. I could feel the strain in the very bones of the boat, the wood of the hull creaking in protest. Then, slowly, an inch at a time, the rope began to feed onto the capstan drum. I was winning, or at least, I wasn't losing yet. The process was agonizing. For every foot of line I gained, the boat would lurch and shudder, threatening to roll. The fog had begun to thin, breaking apart into ghostly gray tendrils, and the sun was a weak, hazy disk in the sky. It offered no warmth, only light to see just how alone I truly was. As the first length of the snag came out of the water, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't my gear. It wasn't a lost net or a lobster trap line. It was a rope, if you could even call it that. It was a hawser, thicker than my thigh, black as tar, and so ancient it seemed to be woven from solidified shadow. It was covered in a thick, slimy carpet of barnacles and strange, pale sea life, things that grow only in the crushing dark of the abyss. The smell that came off it was overpowering, a smell of primeval mud, of decay, of a place that had never seen the sun. My hands, even in the thick gloves, felt the unnatural cold of it. This rope hadn't been in the water for a few years, or even a few decades. It felt like it had been down there since the beginning of time. My mind reeled. What was this? A mooring line from an old wreck? But no wreck I'd ever heard of in these waters would have a line this massive. An old naval anchor, maybe. But the weight was wrong. It felt distributed, like a chain of things, not one single object. Doubt began to creep in, cold and oily. This felt wrong, deeply wrong. I was pulling up something I shouldn't be. There are stories, old fishermen's tales that you laugh about over beers at the tavern, but that you don't quite forget when you're alone in the fog. Stories of things lost at sea, things the government doesn't want found, things that are better left in the dark. I killed the capstan, the sudden silence roaring in my ears. I could just let it go. Let the rope slide back into the gray water, back to its tomb. I could go home, fix my winch, and tell everyone I just snagged a wreck. No one would ever know. It would be the simple, sensible thing to do. But I couldn't. The curiosity was a physical thing now. A hook in my gut, pulling harder than the weight on the line. I had to see. I had to know. I engaged the capstan again. For what felt like an eternity, I just hauled. My back screamed. My arms felt like lead, and my hands were numb. The sun climbed higher, burning the last of the fog away, leaving me exposed under a vast, empty sky. Then I saw it, a dark shape breaking the surface, sending cascades of water sheeting off its sides. It wasn't rock. It wasn't the rusted steel of a wreck. It was angular, man-made. A dark olive-green metal box, scarred and pitted from its time in the sea, but unmistakably solid. It was a footlocker, but bigger, more like a crate, and it looked military-grade, with heavy-duty latches and what looked like welded seams. As I fought to drag its dead weight over the rail, the boat groaning in protest, I saw the chain. A thick, corroded chain was bolted to its side, leading straight back down into the murky green depths. And on the end of that chain, I could just make out the shape of another box, identical to the first, and another one below that. It wasn't one object. It was a string of them, a rosary of secrets pulled from the bottom of the sea. It was something that had no business being there, something that promised to change everything or drag me down to the bottom with it. Would you have the courage to pull this up, or would you have cut the line and sailed away, pretending you saw nothing? Let me know in the comments and subscribe, because you won't believe what was waiting for me inside. The trip back to my slip was the longest 12 miles of my life. Every wave that slapped against the hull sounded like a judgment, every creak of the old wood a warning. The 7 green chests sat on my deck like sleeping monsters, their immense weight making the sea dog ride low and sluggish in the water. I didn't dare use my radio. I didn't dare get too close to any other boats. I felt like the whole world could see what I had, like the secret was painted on my hull in glowing letters. By the time I eased into my private slip, the moon was a sliver in a black sky, and the marina was dead quiet. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie the lines. For an hour, I just sat there in the dark, the engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the boxes. This was it, the moment of truth. I grabbed the angle grinder from my toolbox. The thing was heavy and loud, but it was the only tool I owned that stood a chance against welded steel. I pulled the first smallest chest into the faint circle of light from my deck lamp. The air was cold, smelling of low tide and diesel. I took a deep breath, flipped the switch on the grinder, and the night exploded with noise. The high-pitched scream of the blade hitting metal was deafening, a banshee's wail that I was sure could be heard all the way in town. Sparks flew in a brilliant, angry orange cascade, lighting up my face, reflecting in my wide eyes. It felt like I was committing a crime, like I was breaking into a tomb. The smell of hot, scorched metal filled my lungs, sharp and acrid. My arms vibrated, my teeth rattled in my skull, but I held on, pushing the spinning disc deeper and deeper into the seam. After what felt like an eternity, with a final, groaning pop, the lid gave way. I killed the grinder, and the sudden silence was so profound it roared in my ears. My heart was a frantic drum. I used a crowbar to pry the lid the rest of the way open. It opened with a deep hiss, a gasp of stale, dead air escaping from its decades-long prison. The smell that rolled out was dry and dusty, the scent of forgotten things. Inside, everything was wrapped in thick, dark oilcloth. It looked brittle, ancient. I reached in, my calloused fingers trembling, and touched the cloth. It crumbled into a fine, dark powder at my touch, disintegrating into nothingness. And underneath, my breath caught in my throat. My single, fly-specked deck light hit the contents, and the light didn't just reflect. It was absorbed and thrown back with a warm, heavy glow that seemed to come from within. It was gold. Solid gold bars, nestled tightly together. They weren't the big, rough bricks you see in movies. They were smaller, perfectly uniform, each one stamped with a strange, intricate symbol, a stylized eagle with its wings spread wide over a broken gear. I'd never seen anything like it. I lifted one. The weight was obscene. It was so much heavier than it looked, a dense physical manifestation of pure value that felt utterly alien in my world of rust and brine. I set it down on the deck with a heavy, satisfying thud. I counted them. There were 30 bars in the first chest. I dragged the second chest under the light and started again, the shriek of the grinder echoing my own racing pulse. More gold. Another chest and another. 6 of the 7 chests were filled with it. My deck, the old salt-stained wood I scrubbed every day, was now covered in a king's ransom. I sat down amidst the fortune, my back against the cold steel of the last unopened chest. I pulled a greasy receipt from my pocket and a pencil from behind my ear. I did the math, the weight of each bar, the current price of gold. I did it once, and the number was so big it seemed impossible, a miscalculation by a tired mind. I did it again, and a third time. The numbers swam in front of my eyes, blurring with the sweat that dripped from my brow. Just over $90 million. $90 million. Lying on the deck of a boat the bank was 3 weeks away from repossessing. The world tilted on its axis. I started to laugh, a ragged, choked sound that was half sob. Sterling's face flashed in my mind. A simple life for a simple mind. Simple. I looked at the gold, then at my own torn, greasy hands. Maybe he was right, because no complex mind could ever have stumbled into something like this. A week later, I walked into the marine supply shop. I'd sold 2 of the bars to a discreet buyer in Boston, a man who asked no questions and paid in cash that smelled faintly of a bank vault. I walked up to Sal's counter and laid down a list. A new engine, the best one they made, a top-of-the-line sonar system, a new winch, new lines, new gear, everything. Sal's eyes went wide. "Cal," he started, his voice gentle. This is a lot." Just then, the little bell over the door jingled, and in walked Mr. Sterling. He saw me at the counter, saw my list, and that familiar condescending smirk spread across his face. "Playing pretend, Cal?" he asked, his voice smooth as oil. "Planning your dream boat? It's good to have dreams." I didn't say a word. I just reached into my bag and started pulling out stacks of $100 bills, laying them on the counter, one after another. The smirk on Sterling's face froze, then slowly melted away, replaced by a look of utter, slack-jawed confusion. He looked at the money, then at me, then back at the money. It was like his brain couldn't process the image. A simple fisherman, a piece of local color, paying for $250,000 worth of equipment in cash. I looked him dead in the eye. "Just settling some accounts," I said, my voice quiet, but steady as rock. I left him standing there, speechless, in the middle of the store. The victory didn't feel like I thought it would. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, heavy and absolute. But the money was only half of it. The real secret was that symbol, the eagle and the broken gear. It wasn't a national crest I recognized. It wasn't in any books on military insignia or corporate logos. It was a ghost. This wasn't some lost Spanish treasure. This was something else. Cold War-era smuggling. A hidden payroll for a Black Ops unit that never came home. a private fortune hidden from a world on the brink of collapse. The gold gave me power, but the symbol gave me a mystery that was heavier than all the bars combined. I was no longer just a fisherman. I was the keeper of a $90 million secret with an origin that could be more dangerous than the sea itself. What would you do if you were in my place? Would you just take the money and disappear? Or would you risk it all to find out the truth? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe, because the answer to that question is where this story truly begins. That quiet moment in the supply shop, watching the color drain from Sterling's face, was worth more than any of the gold I'd pulled from the sea. It wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about the silence. The silence that replaced his condescending laugh. The silence that filled the space where his pity used to be. For the first time he saw me, not as a piece of local color, not as a simple relic, but as a man he couldn't understand. And in his world, what he couldn't understand, he feared. That was the first taste of real power, and it was as intoxicating as the cold salt spray on a hard run. But I knew that flashing cash in a supply store was one thing. Turning $90 million in strange gold into a new life was another. I was a fisherman, not a financier. I knew how to read the tides, not the stock market. The last chest, the seventh one, hadn't been filled with gold. I cut it open that same night, my hands still shaking, and found it packed with documents, all sealed in waterproof canisters. They were bearer bonds from the 1950s, issued by a Swiss bank that no longer existed, and ledgers filled with columns of numbers and coded names. It was a ghost's accounting book. On the last page there was a single name and a phone number in Boston. It was a long shot, a number that was almost 70 years old, but it was all I had. I drove to a payphone 2 towns over, my heart pounding with every ring. A dry, reedy voice answered on the third ring. I just said the name from the ledger. There was a long pause, and then the voice said, "Where?" I told him the coordinates where I'd found the chests. Another pause. "You've been a busy man, Mr. Hatcher. I'll be in touch." He hung up. That's how I met the man who turned my impossible fortune into reality. He was a lawyer, or at least he dressed like one. An old man whose eyes seemed to hold the secrets of 100 clients. He took care of everything. Over 6 months, the gold bars vanished, and the money appeared, filtered through a dozen accounts, cleaned, and finally deposited into a new life I had to learn how to live. $92,400,000 after his commission. I stared at the number on the bank statement until it stopped looking real. The first thing I did was buy back my family's name. Sterling's grand waterfront development project had stalled. He'd over-leveraged, promised too much, and the town was pushing back. The centerpiece of his plan, a prime plot of land with a deep water dock, was the very same land my great-grandfather had owned before the Great Depression took it. I bought it, not from Sterling, but from the bank that held his debt. I paid cash. The look on his face when he found out his entire project was now walled in by a man he called a simpleton. That was a memory I'll take to my grave. I didn't build condos. I rebuilt the old fish processing plant. I hired back the sons and daughters of the fishermen who'd lost their boats. I created a co-op, guaranteeing a fair price for their catch, giving them a future. I didn't destroy the old Gloucester. I used my fortune to save it. The Sea Dog is still my home, but she's not the same boat. A new engine purrs where the old one groaned. The hull is reinforced. The electronics are state-of-the-art. From the outside, she still looks like a working boat, a little scarred, a little weathered. But inside, she's a queen. Sterling came to see me one last time. He found me on my dock, mending a net, just like that first day. He looked smaller, his expensive suit rumpled, his slick confidence gone, replaced by a desperate, hollow look. He wanted to buy my land. He offered me double what I paid. When I said no, he offered triple. He talked about progress, about the future, about how we could be partners. I let him talk until he ran out of words. Then I just looked at him, my hands still working the net. "You know, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice quiet. "I'm just a simple man. I wouldn't know the first thing about a complex business deal like that. It's a complicated life for a complicated mind." I used his own words, and I watched them land like stones. He just stood there, his face ashen, and then he turned and walked away. I never saw him again. The money changed my life, but the mystery changed my soul. That symbol, the eagle over the broken gear, it's burned into my mind. I've spent a small fortune on private investigators, historians, and ex-intelligence officers. They've found nothing. It's not a national insignia, not a corporate logo, not a family crest. The gold itself has no history. It's as if it was smelted on another planet and dropped into the ocean. The ledgers were a dead end, the names and codes meaningless without a key. Who were they? Spies? A government that never was? A shadow organization preparing for a world that never came? Every night I stand on the deck of my boat and I look out at that dark expanse of water. The ocean isn't just my livelihood anymore. It's a vault, and I'm the only one who knows it holds more than just fish. I didn't just get a second chance. I was given a secret I can never share, a question I can never answer. Was it just a random snag? A 1 in a billion chance? Or did the sea, in its own mysterious way, decide to settle a score? What do you think? Do you believe a turn of fate this incredible could actually happen? I want to hear your theory. What was the origin of that gold? Was it a Cold War payroll, a pirate's treasure from a different era, or something else entirely? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories from the deep, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Tell me where you're watching from, because no matter where you are, the ocean connects us all.